Well, the excerpt you just heard was from a speech Dr. King gave to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in August 1967. A speech entitled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" which is also the title of a book he wrote in 1967, which asks of his question, where do we go from here, chaos or community? It's a question we're still asking today, especially in the last few years. Well, 1967 was a bleak and difficult time for Dr. King. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 was a distant memory. Other than the right to vote and to drink at any water fountain, very little had fundamentally changed in the lives of individual people. Poverty was inextricable because it was and is inextricably linked to unrepaired systemic injustice resulting from centuries of slavery and decades of Jim Crow, including such things as redlining, literally red lines on a map where banks wouldn't lend to those people. And you know that wealth is often transferred from one generation to another by the increasing value of a home. And did you know that the original covenant in Mission Hills forbid people of color from living in this very neighborhood? The words Caucasian only are actually on paper. In 1967, Dr. King had few friends left, and he lost even more when he got too political. Stay in your lane, preacher. Stick to racism, he was told. Personal salvation, not liberation. But he couldn't help himself but to tie racism, economic exploitation, and war together as triple evils. They're all interrelated. And Dr. King called for nothing less than the restructuring of the whole of American society. He said poverty would never change without systemic disruption. But people in power never want to hear that. Their place in the hierarchy and their wealth is threatened. But on the other side, young African Americans had had it with the idea of nonviolence and gave voice to black power. Cities were in turmoil, and that further frightened white people and that unrest gave what many thought was a higher moral ground. Still, today, the destruction of property for many people is more problematic than the issues of suffering and injustice they illuminate. So Dr. King asked, where do we go from here? Among decades of brilliant speeches and sermons, to me, this is one of his best and still relevant. Chaos or community. So first, he said, we must massively assert our dignity and worth. We must stand up amid a system that still oppresses us and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of value. We must no longer be ashamed of being black. Then, he said, we must discover how to organize our strength into economic and political power. From the old plantations of the South to the newer ghettos of the North, the Negro has been confined to a life of voicelessness and powerlessness. Stripped of the right to make decisions concerning his life and destiny, he has been subject to the authoritarian and sometimes whimsical decisions of the white power structure. The plantation and the ghetto were created by those who had power, both to confine those who had no power and to perpetuate their powerlessness. Now, Dr. King acknowledged that the word power makes some people uncomfortable. But he said, there is nothing wrong with power if power is used correctly. One of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. We've got to get this thing right. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive. I want to say that again. Power without love is reckless and abusive. And that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. Dr. King's speech was over an hour long, so I am taking pieces and parts. This is the third point he makes. We must develop progress, or rather a program that will drive the nation to a guaranteed annual income. We must create full employment, or we must create incomes. And he cited John Kenneth Galbraith, the acclaimed economist, who said that a guaranteed annual income could be done for about $20 billion a year. And I say to you that if a nation can spend $35 billion a year to fight an unjust, evil war in Vietnam, and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, well, it can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet right here on earth. This was a very long and central part of his speech. Then he went on to respond to unrest in cities and calls for black power and separatism, as Malcolm X and others advocated. But Dr. King continued to argue for nonviolence and integration, and his speech goes into this extensively. He said, without recognizing this, we will end up with answers that don't answer, explanations that don't explain, and solutions that don't solve. This is no time for romantic illusions and empty philosophical debates about freedom. This is a time for action. What is needed is a strategy for change, a tactical program, and so far this has only been offered by the nonviolent movement. He concluded this long section. I'm concerned about our better world. I'm concerned about justice. I'm concerned about brotherhood. I'm concerned about truth. And when one is concerned about that, he can never advocate violence. Because through violence, you may murder a murderer, but you can't murder murder. Through violence, you may murder a liar, but you can't establish truth. Through violence, you may murder a hater, but you can't murder hate through violence. Darkness cannot put out darkness. Only light can do that. Therefore, Dr. King said, I have decided to stick with love because I know that love is ultimately the only answer to humankind's problems. And I'm not talking about emotional bosh when I talk about love. I'm talking about a strong, demanding love. For I have seen too much hate. I've seen too much hate on the faces of sheriffs in the South. I've seen hate on the faces of too many Klansmen and too many white citizens counselors in the South to want to hate. Because every time I see it, I know that it does something to their faces and their personalities, and I have to say to myself that hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to love. If you're seeking the highest good, I think you find it through love. I want to insert in here that these words are not about telling others what they should do. People with power should never tell people without what their strategy should be. This is about people who are victims of virulent, violent hate, as Dr. King described, coming to this conclusion for themselves. Otherwise, it's paternalistic patronization. And that's why people who love the I have a dream speech sometimes don't like this one. The dream, or selective quotes at least, that doesn't require anyone or anything to change. Dr. King concluded, as we talk about where do we go from here, we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. And when you ask that question, you begin to question the entire capitalistic economy. Now, he had already discussed at length that Marxism and communism were not better solutions. And that's where the part of the speech we heard today, that's where it starts. And that's the whole point behind his words that follow. Let us be dissatisfied. Let us be dissatisfied until America will no longer have a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds. Let us be dissatisfied until the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort from the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. I'm not going to read them all. You've already heard them in much better soaring oratory. So I encourage you to go back and read or listen to the whole speech. So some of you might be asking, well, what does this have to do with the gospel reading from Luke today? Well, after Jesus read from the scroll of Isaiah, he sat down and everyone praised him. We're so proud because he's a hometown boy made big. If only he had stayed in his seat and kept his mouth shut. People would have loved it and loved him. He talked about people who are poor, prisoners, people who are blind or rather act blindly. But then in the section you'll hear in 2 weeks, he talked about those other people in ways they didn't want to hear. He got political. And he riled them up so much that they dragged him. They dragged him out of the synagogue and to the edge of town so they could throw Jesus, off a cliff. He should have stayed in his own lane. Preach salvation, not liberation. Save souls, not societies. The words in today's reading mark the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. We know how it ends. Religion and state conspire to have him executed on a cross and send a message to other would-be messiahs. That will shut him up and scare away his followers. Didn't work. And that's why we're here today as Christians. So Dr. King gave this speech in 1967 in August, and in April 1968 he was assassinated. He should have stuck with the more palatable message about the color of the skin and the content of the character. His literally fatal mistake was to talk not only of racism, but to change the economic exploitation tied to war. Triple evils, he called them. And by doing that, he lost the admiration of both friends and many moderates. As we honor the life and legacy of Dr. King today and tomorrow, remember the challenges he named and the callings we have. Because the question remains today, where do we go from here? Chaos or community? Let's pray our prayer of